So welcome to this third lecture on quantitative methods of research. We have already talked about the characteristics of quantitative method of study. We have talked about conceptualization of research. And in this lecture, we are going to talk about operationalization of the research. How do you get to it? How do you go about your research? So, in terms of operationalization of the research, we are asking some basic questions. What type of data do I need to test my hypothesis, to verify my conceptual framework? Where will I get this data? Who will be my population and my participants of this study? What method exactly that I will use to collect this data? How am I going to analyze this data? So when I answer this question, actually I am operationalizing my research. I am putting my research into action, into a plan, and that will lead me to the actual data. Operationalization actually appears in the method section or the chapter of our research report. So the method section of our research report will have these following sections answering the questions that we have raised. First, we begin to talk about research design. What type of general plan do I have in collecting my data and dealing with my data until I can report about it? Secondly, my participants. Who are my participants? I would begin with the population and go on to sampling procedures, sampling size in terms of describing my participants. Thirdly, I would spend some time explaining the actual method of data collection, which is also in terms of procedure that will be followed, particularly when your research is going to be an experimental design or a quasi-experimental design. And then you will talk about, particularly in quantitative research, about instruments of measure. How are you going to measure your variables and the tools that you are going to use to collect your data? Then you will talk about data analysis. And fourthly, you might spend some time discussing the ethical issues that are related to your research. And this forms the content of the method chapter. And this is exactly what we are talking about in terms of operationalization. So in the next few lectures, we would explore step by step all these 5-6 elements of research, particularly from the quantitative perspective. So now let us talk about research design. What are the common research designs used to gather quantitative data? One of the main methods of research or research design used to gather quantitative data is what we call survey. Survey, in common language, is to have an overall view. So what does survey mean in terms of research? It entails a large sample size. Secondly, it is not going into details about individuals, but it is going to gather a general data about this sampled population. And so often the tool that is used for a survey is questionnaire. A questionnaire has items, and these items often are closed questions. Individuals have to just tick answers. And the advantage of ticking these answers is that you get participants to cooperate with you very effectively, unlike open-ended questions where participants have a lot of effort to write down the answers. Here they just tick. The second advantage of ticking the answers is that you can count them. And so when you count, you're reducing this data to quantitative data, numeral data. And that is so important in quantitative method of research. Now, questionnaires should not be mixed up with what is called the schedule method. Now, what is schedule method, as sociologists refer to? A schedule method is using a questionnaire, and on the basis of the questionnaire, you conduct a very structured interview with your participants, particularly in cases where you are dealing with illiterate population or a sample that does not have the time to answer your questions, sitting down, ticking them. Maybe you want to ask these questions on the move. And so the method that you're using is not really interview, but schedule. Why it is not interview? Because interview presupposes really exploration of what the individuals are talking about. Whereas in schedule, you are actually using a questionnaire, but rather than being a self-administered questionnaire where the participants themselves answer the question, in schedule, you are asking the questions and the participants answer them, and you tick the answers on their behalf. So basically, the end product is the same. And these are tools that are used in survey. Another important research design in quantitative methods of study is experiment. The advantage of experiment is that we can establish cause and effect relationship. In survey, we can only examine correlations. We can only compare two groups in terms of their mean scores. Whereas if we want to establish cause and effect relationship, then we need to go for experiment. Usually, we say experiments in quantitative research use what we call controlled trials. So let us say we have two groups, and one group is called the experiment group, and the other group is called the control group. And you can also have a third group of very technical research like medicine. They have what they call the placebo group. So what happens? The experiment group is given the intervention. The intervention is often the manipulation of the independent variable, so that we can see if this independent variable is actually causing this effect called the dependent variable. So we manipulate the independent variable to see the corresponding effect. So the group in which this independent variable is manipulated is called the intervention group or the experiment group. Usually, the control group will have no intervention or the usual intervention. So for instance, let us say a doctoral student is working on an experiment of what would be the effect of cognitive behavioral therapy on women who have suffered domestic violence. Now, she takes two groups. One group is given this cognitive behavioral therapy. The other group is given the usual therapy, whatever that is. And it should be made sure that it is not cognitive behavioral therapy. So the group that is having the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, would be called the experiment group. The group that is having the usual intervention, usual method of dealing with them, because ethically we cannot just leave them as they are, then we call them the control group. After 10 weeks or so, we compare the results. Then, if CBT group has performed better than the usual therapy group, then we can make a claim that CBT is a cause of the cure of the psychological impact suffered out of domestic violence. You can have a placebo group where it is an imitation of an intervention. And so, finally, what are we saying? When we have an experiment design, we have more than one time measurement. We need to take the measurement at the beginning of the experiment and at the end of the experiment, and we compare the results. Surely, one of the groups that performs well after the experiment means then this experiment really had an impact. But often, we cannot manipulate the independent variable. For example, let us say my research question is, what is the impact of the terrorist attack on children? Now, I cannot cause a terrorist attack to see the impact. So we need to study it from the real environment where children have suffered terrorist attack. So we call this quasi or quasi experiment. It is something like an experiment, but it is not that we are manipulating the independent variable. And but in any case, we will have to have two groups. That is why it is called an experiment design. But it is not a full experiment because we are not artificially creating that situation. So for instance, in the case of children who have suffered the trauma out of terrorist attack, we can compare a group of children who have been exposed to terrorist attack with a group of children who have not been exposed to terrorist attack. And these two groups resemble in age and gender, other variables. And then we measure their trauma level. And if the group that was exposed to terrorist attack shows higher level of trauma, then we can claim that it is the terrorist attack that actually caused the trauma. And this is a quasi-experiment. Now, we are talking about very specific designs in research that give us the possibility to quantitative data. And finally, often as an undergraduate student, you may not end up doing experiments. But you can do one of the following two research methods, which are basically often quasi-experimental or just exploratory studies. One, correlational study. And second, comparison of mean scores. What is correlational study? It's a design, it's a research design where you take a population and a sample from within the population, you are measuring for two variables, and you carry out a test called correlational test to see if the variation in one variable is accompanied by the variation in another variable. And if there is a significant result, then we say one variable is correlated to another variable. So in our case, let us say, let us go back to my initial example of the time spent in study and the results in an examination. So I measure the time spent in study and I correlate that to the results in an examination. Then if I can see that as the time spent in study increases, the results in an examination also increases, then we can claim that there is a correlation. But remember, correlation does not mean causal relationship, and that is a subject for another lecture. Another important design that can be used, especially in undergraduate levels, is to compare two groups. Let us say you have two departments in your university. Now, we want to see which department is doing well in research methods. So we can give a test to the particular, let us say, a particular number of participants or students from a department, and we take more or less the same number from another department. We give them the same test. Then we can compare their average scores, and that is called the comparison of means design. So between correlation and comparison of means, we can do a lot of quantitative research. And in fact, quantitative research should be thought in these terms. Otherwise, you would end up doing a qualitative study, or you might end up doing a quantitative study only with descriptive statistics. Now, what is descriptive statistics is a subject for another lecture.